Achtung, Achtung. Hier ist die Sendestelle Berlin im Voxhaus. Meine Damen und Herren.
Welcome to the Achtung History Podcast, presented by myself, Simon J. James, and produced by theberlintourguide.com. This week, episode 6 of The Nazi and the Moon, Explorer. Caught in conversation, the two smiled and jeered with one another. The train had been rattling along the rail lines of the United States for quite some time, but passage was reasonably comfortable. More comfortable than the trains had been in Germany towards the end of the war. The train was made of numerous Pullman sleeper wagons, and it was packed with people from all across the nation. Soldiers returning from war, businessmen and salespeople, tourists and travellers, all passing through the varied topographical landscape with its equally varied fauna. But neither looked out of the window. They each were caught in the enthralls of conversation. He, Major James Hamill, could not help but be nervous. The car had been filled with members of the U.S. Airborne divisions who had been wounded during the war, and now were on their way home. His charge, the blonde-haired and blue-eyed rocket scientist by the name of Wernher von Braun, was a key asset that the United States had managed to acquire, but the Germans, even with the war over, were still the enemy. The devilish propaganda that had been displayed during the war years, characterizing the German people as beasts, did not fade out overnight. But then, there he was, the man with a heavy German accent, speaking merrily away. "Where are you from?" the American had asked of the German rocket scientist. "Switzerland," von Braun replied with a gleeful grin that had allowed him to get away with much throughout his life. "Switzerland!" the American repeated with a slapping of his leg. "Sure, I know Switzerland. What do you do there?" "I work with steel, the steel business." The American slapped his leg again with a sound that caught much attention throughout the carriage, and Hamill. "This cannot be true. I happen to know Switzerland very well, and I'm also in the steel business. Now tell me, where is your speciality?" Hamill looked over. Hamill had wavy hair and a face that was elongated, wide at the top, narrower at the bottom. With two front teeth that protruded slightly and a heavy lower lip, he had, somewhat, the characteristics of a beaver. He had a worry that this conversation between the two could be a problem. Von Braun, along with the other rocket scientists of Operation Overcast, slowly being referred to as Paperclip, had the process of arrival in the United States expedited. To keep their arrival secret and undercover, none had passed through immigration. It was true they each had a 6-month contract, but the money from said contract all was converted into the Reichsmark that still bore the images of the now defeated Third Reich and placed within German bank accounts. The train was nearing the border of Arkansas and Texas. Flat lands revealed the American way of life as the train crossed over the Red River that oozed brown. Towns were ordered and regimental. They lacked character, but they had order. An American way so different to that of Werner's old country, a Germany that had been steeped in tradition but had allowed for an organizational mess to limit his advances, and now, whilst talking with this excitable businessman, he could see that the American order might just be his future. "Now, ball bearings, they're important," the American began. Werner was enjoying the conversation, but having to keep up the ruse of not being a German rocket scientist, and instead being a Swiss steelman, was beginning to deplete his knowledge and energies. Luckily, however, the train had begun to slow, and it pulled into a station. The station was dominated by a brick building that showed the aspirations of a town in its infancy, but reflected that it had not quite reached the peak of what it had wished for itself. Brick that should have been clad was exposed. What was clad had only reached the bare minimum of columns and the pediments. Windows were singularly plated where there was glass, and the wide layout of tracks held multiple boxcars with weeds growing in between. Perhaps some of those boxcars contained his projects. A sign over the platform read, "Union Station, Texarkana," an apt name for a town whose main attraction was the fact that it, and even the station, lay half in Arkansas and half in Texas, and seemed abandoned by both. "Got to dash. Nice to meet you, sir." "And you?" "I got to thank you," the man said as he stood quickly to exit. "If it wasn't for the help that you Swiss gave us, there is no telling as to who might have won the war. So long." Wernher was left with a smile on his face, and he recanted the whole tale to Major Hamel when he took over the American businessman's seat and inquired after the conversation. Major Hamel, even after their arrival at Fort Bliss on the 8th of October 1945, had to stick by the side of von Braun. Fort Bliss had been an experience for both of them. Laying outside of El Paso, Texas, it was as far away from the sea life that von Braun had enjoyed in childhood at Spiekeroog and as a rocket scientist at Usedom. There was little green to be seen except for the sun-darkened shrubs that covered a ridge not far from the base. There appeared no escape from the sun, no refreshing water of mountain lake or Baltic Sea, no endless forest, just nothing. The commander had not been aware of their arrival and was less happy to discover that travelling with a major was a German. He had allowed them in, as he had no choice, but he made sure that von Braun remained within Hamel's care. Von Braun became ill once again, and finally a diagnosis of hepatitis A followed by a hospital stay of 8 weeks. 8 weeks in a hospital surrounded by Americans who had been injured during the war. There was not a comfortable air. Upon leaving the hospital, however, there was some welcome news in sight. Exactly 2 months after he had arrived himself at the Fort Bliss military base, his brother, along with others from the operation, arrived. Familiar faces, family, and the people he needed to start work on the A4 rocket, but this time for the Americans. More and more arrived. It was a steady train of those von Braun had considered most valuable. In January, Arthur Rudolph, who had overseen the production line at Mittelbau-Dora and was implicit in the crimes committed, arrived along with 68 other people. More arrived in February. Von Braun, however, had not waited for them to begin work. Work began just 2 days after his brother Magnus had arrived at Fort Bliss, where initial work was to begin on designing something they were aware of but had not developed themselves before, a ramjet, a type of air-breathing jet engine that, in using the forward motion of the engine, compresses the incoming air without the need for axial compressors or centrifugal compressors. Von Braun worked tirelessly by hand on a 40-page document that would lay out his beliefs as to how it should work, its efficiency, and what potential failings it could face. Wernher von Braun had expressed interest in the idea before, when it was called the Volta engine. Von Braun and Dornberger had used Volta engines on the A5 when testing aerodynamic shapes due to the cheaper cost of the engines, which had also powered the Heinkel HE-176 that had been tested for 50 seconds at the Heinkel base at Rostock. Whilst von Braun and the other scientists, working in the basic facilities that were offered to them, as they awaited trainloads of equipment that had been salvaged before the handing over of the areas to the Soviets to arrive, began theoretical thinking. Von Braun sent numerous members of his program to White Sands, a national park 80 kilometers north in New Mexico, where, before von Braun's arrival in 1945, the first atom bomb had been tested. An area that in habitation stretches back 12,000 years, and today, with endemic species and in 2020, is surrounded by military installations. Here at the White Sands Proving Grounds, the scientists of the A4 V2 program were to bring together the pieces and scraps that had been salvaged. Here they would train Americans under General Electric's Project Hermes in building and assembling the rockets. But if von Braun was to believe that the hindrances of the past might have been left behind, the keeping of information to different groups, the squabbling between military forces, the budgeting, he was mistaken. Under the Luftwaffe, when Peenemünde had begun, and the army, von Braun had an almost limitless supply of money compared to the penny-pinching days when pencil sharpeners and typewriters were out of their budget. But now, in America, they were back to those early days. As Germans who potentially could return to Germany and therefore be snatched by the Soviets, the progress American scientists were making was kept away from them. So research was done on their own. Facilities were worse than Peenemünde, wooden huts, no aerodynamicist, no air conditioning, to save them from the cold desert nights and brutal midday heat. Building a rocket program on the scraps of that of the Nazis. Morale dropped when letters took months to arrive from family members who only talked for the bickering the wives were involved in the camps in Bavaria. Frustrations rose, and some began to think of returning home, not that the Americans ever really planned on allowing them. However, there was little that they could do. Some nameless pamphlets complaining fell on ears that did not care. The workers had to continue on. They were not free people. In 1946, the Upper Atmosphere Research Panel, known also as the V2 Panel, was formed to oversee the launches and the experiments conducted with the V2 rockets. The first meeting of which took place at Princeton University on the 27th of February, 1946. And the original committee consisted of nuclear physicist Ernst Henry Krause of the Naval Research Laboratory, G.K. Magirian from General Electric acting as secretary, and amongst others, scientist James Van Allen and astronomer Fred Lawrence Whipple. Using rigging that had been salvaged in Germany, a test stand was constructed, and slowly A4V2s began to near completion. However, due to the turbulent time these parts had faced from the beginning of their production in the concentration camp to transportation in freight cars and on boats until eventually arriving in America, many of the parts were naturally unusable. Finally, however, on the 16th of April 1946, not even a year after Germany's surrender, the first of the rockets would launch. It was somewhat of a disappointment. The rocket left the launch pad and appeared to fly true, but at an altitude of 5.5 kilometers it spun out of control and fell back to Earth, destroyed. It was determined that fin number 4 had failed prior to the cut-off of the engine, and the radio itself had failed after 19.5 seconds from launch. The second launch was far more of a success. On the 10th of May, another V2 launched and flew true, reaching a height of 112 kilometers, some almost 70 kilometers shy of the rocket MW18014 that von Braun and Dornberger had watched on the 20th of June 1944 that had first pierced space. Test numbers 4 and 5, the test number 1 having been a static test of the engine, followed in the same suit, both reaching a similar altitude of between 112 kilometers and 118 kilometers. Von Braun, however, was not there to witness them. Instead, he, Walter Riedel, Karl Heimberg, and Kurt de Bus, along with an American sergeant, were on somewhat of an excursion. Traveling along in a car that the scientists had bought communally, they are able to witness the spectacle of California. The magnificent mountain ranges above which the great Hugo Erckner had once navigated in the Graf Zeppelin, the bustling cosmopolitan city of San Diego, and the majesty of the Californian coastline. However, anything of moderate spectacle would have seemed wondrous to their eyes, for that they had seen nothing but dirt and sand for the last few months. The journey seemed to inspire something within von Braun, the possibilities away from the reclusive nature of a military base that America presented, and the new sense of freedom, except for the sergeant in the car, of course. Throughout the rest of the year, the GE Project Hermes tests continued, as von Braun fought to bring more of those he had selected as being essential to the rocket program from Germany to America. Yet the political shift of President Truman towards disarmament and a reduction of expenditure on military programs was putting the progress of the rocket programs in jeopardy. Despite the warning of former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in March of 1946 at the Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, that an iron curtain had descended from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, America was demobilizing. However, on the 24th of October 1946, a Mittelwerk-manufactured rocket achieved something great. From the blackness of the mine-like factory, where there was little but death and destruction, a V2 rocket emerged, that through bundled into a cart and carriage, ship and truck was transported to White Sands, produced something pure. On the 23rd of March 1946, GE Hermes test rocket V2-13 launched, and although it did not reach the heights of the MW18014, it did carry upon itself a 35mm black and white motion picture camera. A camera that produced the first ever image of Earth from space. From such horror, something pure was produced, and it was an image, grainy but clear, that with the blackness of space and Earth veiled in a swirl of clouds, showed man reduced to insignificance. In July of that year, the von Braun brothers in America received some welcome news. For months they had been hearing of the horrors that were befalling the German people and the lands that were once German beyond the order. At the Potsdam Conference of August 1945, the decision was made that the Soviet Union would be moved westward. In 1939, Hitler's foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop had signed with Stalin's foreign minister Vyacheslav Molotov a pact that bore both their surnames. It was a non-aggression pact and agreed that both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany would invade Poland and divide its land amongst themselves. Britain and France were themselves part of a pact that, after the German invasion of Czechoslovakia, Britain had released a statement over that read, "In the event of any action which clearly threatened Polish independence, and which the Polish government accordingly considered vital to resist with their national forces, His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Polish government all support in their power." But when Germany and the Soviet Union invaded, only Germany had war declared against it. The Soviets were pushed out of their territory with the breaking of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany. But when the war was over, at least for the Soviets, the Potsdam Conference gifted them the territory of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and more, taking over the eastern half of Poland as their own land, and Poland was compensated with the German lands of East Brandenburg, Silesia, Pomerania, and half of East Prussia. The ensuing eviction of the German people would result in the movements of ultimately 3.5 million people from the new land of Poland, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not in the millions. During this time, property was looted, women raped, money seized, amongst many other horrors. And for the von Braun brothers, they had waited news of their parents, who were amongst those being forced to leave, but had heard nothing of. It was the news, therefore, of the elder Magnus von Braun and Emmy von Braun's transportation on the 27th of July 1946 to Landshut in Bavaria that was welcomed. A relief for Wernher and his brother Magnus that their parents had survived the horrors of the road, even if they had lost their family estate and all of their heirlooms. It was reassuring to know that the journey was over. Happiness of being reunited became triumphant in a letter sent little over a month later to his parents. Wernher confessed a love for his first cousin, Maria von Quistrop, who happened to be visiting his parents when the letter arrived, and quickly Maria was asked for a reply from a jubilant Magnus von Braun Sr., who interpreted the whole event as a marriage proposal and asked Maria for a reply, to which she said yes, which she relayed to him in a letter that arrived a month later on the 3rd of October, 1946. The next month he was finally signed onto a new contract, the original having run its course many months prior, but things in Washington ran slowly, especially when considering they were dealing with people who were the former enemies, as they weighed up who was the new enemy. Von Braun signed a contract that paid him a very reasonable, very respectable, middle-class income, and in the same month the rocket scientists moved from their old lodgings into new. The old lodgings had become ramshackled. Walls were falling down in places, and damage had been done in many other places as the men, who had been predominantly confined to the base until the 13th of September 1946, when they were allowed to leave unaccompanied, had, in the absence of any women, returned to young boys in behavior, and used fire extinguishers, pillows, and anything they could place their hands upon to have playful battles between different groups that resulted in much chaos caused. The new were to allow for better conditions, but also for the hope that more of the paperclip scientists might be allowed to travel across the great Atlantic to America. In October came worrying news from Germany, not over family but over former friends. It was well known that as Americans were testing the V-2s themselves, the Soviets were continuing work as well, to test the capabilities and to see what the German rocket scientists knew. Helmut Grottrup had chosen to remain in Germany. He was perhaps a little more connected with the earth than von Braun, who was with the stars, and chose to remain where his culture lay. He had worked with the second-tier scientists who had not been evacuated under Overcast and later Paperclip, and with those who, like himself, had chosen to stay. The promise, the propaganda that the Soviets had blasted across the border at Thuringen towards where von Braun had been interred had said they would remain in Germany. But like all teapots made of chocolate, it was a useless promise. On the 22nd of October 1946, the rocket scientists who remained in Thuringen were awoken by Red Army soldiers and the MVD, the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs. Fritz Karl Preichstadt, one of the engineers who documents still say was recruited to the Soviet Union, but in reality, with a gun barrel to their backs, was stolen away, remembered.
Between midnight and 3 a.m., when everybody was asleep, they knew exactly where I lived, first of all. A few days before I was captured, a fellow came. They had a key. They had everything to the apartment, to the door. There was one interpreter who told me, in German, "Get up, you are being mobilized to work in Russia." And there were about half a dozen soldiers with machine guns who surrounded me. When I wanted to go to the toilet, they checked it out first to make sure there was no escape hatch. It was a very tight operation. They did that with every family. Many families came, while I was alone.
Over 2,200 German specialists were spirited away in a night, and, counting family members, a total of roughly 6,000 people effectively disappeared overnight. It wasn't just people, equipment also went. Carl Zeiss Allgemeinschaft had just 582 pieces of equipment left after the operation, down from 10,000. The Soviet Union was fearing a resurgence of German technology, even in the sector it controlled, and wanted to ensure that technology was going to be just for themselves and hidden away in the east. The rocket work would become more secretive than the work in Mittelwerk that was so close to the border. Many of these scientists would be interred for over 6 years. For von Braun, life was very different. Freedoms granted in September allowed him to travel into El Paso alone, and in December, news was finally broken that the German rocket engineers were in America. The New York Times ran a story on the 4th of December, delayed from an interview on the 19th of November due to military censorship, on page 35, that read,
Nazi scientists aid army on research. Hundreds are revealed to be in US, showing how they build rockets. Other things.
There is a picture of von Braun, his name, below, missing the space between von and Braun, inspecting a V2 engine, but curiously there is no other mention of him in the article. The article ends,
The former pets of Hitler, whom millions of marks were lavished to carry out on their work, now live atop a small knoll within Wright Field in wooden barracks, formerly occupied by the National Youth Administration. Recreational facilities consist of a swimming pool and space for fistball, a variation of American handball.
It is perhaps by coincidence that the article is located next to another showing Reverend Martin Niemöller, the one-time supporter of Hitler who turned against the dictator for the Nazi controls on the church, for which he was imprisoned in Dachau, amongst other concentration camps. He also penned the famous verse, "First they came for, and I didn't speak out." In early 1947, von Braun would return to Germany for the first time since Operation Overcast. His mother was gravely ill, and wishing to bring over his family, including his fiancée Maria, he was hurrying to Germany to marry so that Maria could be counted as a dependent. It was vital. With food shortages in Germany due to the harsh winter, with hundreds of thousands of people dying across Europe due to starvation and the lack of fuel, it was vital to von Braun to get his family to America. In Landshut, von Braun and Maria were married, and then retired to their quarters, which escorting American military police, perhaps fearful the Soviets might try an operation to steal the young genius away, had already made their home within. A month after his departure to Germany, von Braun, his new wife, and his parents sailed into Manhattan on the 26th of March, 1947, and the von Brauns all would begin a new life. The news of von Braun being in America in 1947 started to cause controversy. Groups began to question what was the morality of employing scientists that had been in the employ of Hitler. For von Braun, it was a very convenient time to find religion. He had begun to question morality over the developments of weapons of war with the news of the atom bombs dropped over Japan. He, it seems, had not questioned morality as he walked through the tunnels of Mittelbau Dora, where the stench of death reeked and filled every atom of the air. Dora that was now being hushed up by the Americans, so not as to cause further controversy despite Arthur Rudolph's role in the horrendous condition. Rudolf, who was now in Fort Bliss. One scientist, not at the Fort Bliss base, Georg Richey, was sent back to Germany to stand trial in Dachau, and despite being general manager of Mittelwerk, he was acquitted thanks to the testimony of Rudolf. The blame was put on the guards and the capos, the prisoners who acted as police in exchange for better conditions, for the deaths, not on those who managed the conditions and forced the labor to work harder with the hanging of prisoners, or the food supply from which many died due to a lack of. In total, 15 guards and capos were convicted. One, Moser, was hung. Erhard Browning, subject of episode 3, who committed the massacre in the barn at Eisenschnibbe, was given a life sentence but died 3 years later from leukemia in prison. For the others that it is known about, Wilhelm Simon, born the 23rd of April 1900 in Wuppertal, SS Oberscharführer and labor manager, sentenced to life in prison, served 7 years, released in 1954. Otto Brinkmann, born the 5th of July in Osnabrück, SS Hauptscharführer, sentenced, life in prison, served little over 10 years, released. Heinrich Detmers, born 20th of April 1919, Norden, SS Obersturmführer and Camp Commandant Adjutant, sentenced to 7 years, served 3, released. Kurt Heinrich, born 23rd of May 1911 in Zittau, SS Obersturmführer and Camp Commandant Adjutant, acquitted. Josef Fuchsloch, 19th of March 1896, SS Oberscharführer, acquitted. Heinrich Schmidt, born the 27th of March 1912, Altenburg, SS Hauptsturmführer, Camp Doctor in Buchenwald, Mittelbau-Dora, and later Dachau, acquitted. George Richey, born 25th of August 1898, Hildesheim, General Manager, Mittelwerk GmbH, acquitted. Of the other 10 who received sentences varying from 5 to life, it is almost certain that they did not serve their full sentences. The Dora trial was a mockery of justice to those who had perished in the camp and factory. It was not until 20 years later that the full horrors of that camp came to light as being an American trial, and not a war crimes trial overseen by the Allied nations. It was hushed up significantly, as was von Braun's own SS membership, and no connection was drawn in the press between the camp name and that of the rocket program. Eventually, in 1948, von Braun had to fill out his denazification form, from which he was labeled an opportunist, someone who used the horrid regime to better themselves, used the suffering of others so they could advance, supported tyranny because it was beneficial to one's own standing, or a fellow traveller. Meanwhile, General Electric continued with their tests of the V-2 rockets. Now well trained, the Germans were no longer required. Instead, von Braun and co. continued work on the ramjet engines and rockets that were labeled as Hermes 2, but financing was difficult due to the American people's will to demilitarize. For von Braun, he was beginning to understand that if the government of the Land of Plenty could not offer the riches he wished for, he needed to appeal to the imaginations and minds of the American people as to why rocketry, and in particular space travel, was important. He wanted to put into the mind's eye of the Americans the visions he had had whilst a child gazing at the stars, or whilst firing rocket cars down Berlin streets. What better way than to write a novel? He sat down in 1948 and worked tirelessly into the night and into the following year, writing of a journey to Mars, for the moon had already been done by Méliès and Lang. Mars was further and more difficult. All the problems that would have to be faced were laid bare within the substantial book. It was a manuscript for him and his dreams to speak to the American people, but the rocket within was always in duality. A rocket for a peaceful mission, but it also, naturally, could be used as a rocket of war. In 1949, the Cold War, it could be said, began in earnest. The threat of nuclear winter became real as the Soviet Union tested its first atom bomb, and the playing field of war was leveled once again. America, that had enjoyed dominance, now had an equal, and soon fear was to spread in the people and the government of America. In 1950, America and the Soviet Union came to blows in a proxy war in Korea, and demilitarization was no longer on the cards. That same year, Wernher von Braun's book was rejected from every publisher for being too scientific and, 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 The scientists were moved to a new facility. It was a manuscript for him They were no longer to be confined to the desert wasteland of El Paso, but rather to the green and humid Huntsville, Alabama. Korea would quadruple the defense budget, and the fear that the communist advances in Korea were a precursor to the fall of Western Europe would spur the US into further action towards researching rocketry as the need for surface-to-surface missiles, perhaps tipped with nuclear warheads, grew. Wernher von Braun was given the title of project director of the Ordnance Guided Missile Center under the command of the man who had chaperoned him on the train on his initial journey to Fort Bliss, Major James Hamill. In Huntsville, the Hermes 2 project was effectively scrapped as the technology required too much work, and the need for a weapon of war was too great. The V2 was put forward as an alternative, but made much larger and more powerful. Naturally, however, as Hitler had predicted many years prior, the guidance system was still the issue. The missile was supposed to carry a huge warhead, a 3 metric ton nuclear warhead, and drop it within 900 meters of a target, and naturally, therefore, there seemed not to be a guidance system capable. Problems grew further when the target for accuracy was raised to a missile falling within just a 137-meter diameter circle as a target point. A guidance department was established at the base in Huntsville, but it was decided that production would be outsourced to Ford, and so would production of the body of the missile be outsourced, this time to Chrysler. The American concept of manufacturing was not to keep all pieces under one roof, but to outsource and then bring the components together. The new rocket designs would take their name from the arsenal at Huntsville, Redstone. Meanwhile, von Braun was gaining publicity and writing papers, especially the importance of satellite vehicles towards interplanetary flight, which received invites to speak for the spaceflight organizations of Britain, West Germany, and his new home in America. His book was picked up by a West German publisher, and through the use of a Nazi propagandist ghostwriter, Fritz Ludwig Neher, it was rewritten, and the idea was it would eventually be published. Designs of von Braun's depicting a bicycle wheel-like space station rotating around a central axle were picked up by the press after a speech von Braun had made. These designs were polished by artists and would later go on to inspire others who dreamed of space either for science or for film, with the designs of Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey being reminiscent of these earlier von Braun ideas. Von Braun slowly picked up momentum in himself. The cult of von Braun was growing. When magazine colliers and a writer from said magazine, Cornelius Ryan, approached von Braun with skepticism, von Braun was able to act as a salesman and bring them over to the idea of space as a new frontier. Not because it was clean and untouched, except for a few V2s brushing against it, but because it was seen as being a conquest and being above the Soviets. Von Braun was invited to write a 20-page article for Collier's, and this would be his big break. Von Braun sent a huge paper to which the publicists, along with von Braun's colleague from the early 30s, Willy Ley, who already had, as a science fiction writer, published many books on the subject of space, worked tirelessly to bring the scientific jargon down to terms in which the reader could understand, and make space seem not as a realm for scientists, but as something that everyone could dream over. Designs were changed from real-world designs to those that would rather appeal to the idealism of the reader. Aesthetics were important on the pages, but in reality irrelevant in the wake of aerodynamics. Perhaps why the sleek curves of the A4 V2 was the only pretty to the eye rocket to ever launch. The plan worked, the press were hooked. An article which was initially intended to be part of a collaborative series with Ley's name as the main was soon washed over with the popularity of von Braun's contribution, naturally homed by Ley. Collier's also launched a massive press junket, releasing tens of thousands of press kits to shops, newspapers, radio stations, all across the country. In March 1952, the month in which the magazine was released, von Braun was invited to New York. Could the irony be lost onto him? He was walking the streets of New York, passing the windows of department stores in which his designs were displayed. A full circle since all those years ago, when he first met his hero, Bert, whilst hanging a display based on designs of the woman in the moon. Now he was looking onto his own and perhaps influencing the next generation of rocket scientists and engineers. The program that von Braun was really pushing, however, was to have a space station as a weapon of war. Since his parents' eviction from their land and the loss of both the von Braun and Quistrop family estates, he had become deeply anti-Soviet. and he saw that being the first to space would exert a world dominance control, either for peace in the terms of being so advanced it could intimidate other nations, or so powerful it wouldn't let another nation hide weapons or developments. He once said,
"The US must immediately embark on a long-range development program to secure from the West space superiority. If we do not, somebody else will."
Later, he would give a speech to a prestigious circle of people in Washington, a speech entitled Space Superiority as a Means for Achieving World Peace. Not long after, there was a movement and discussions towards finding funding to begin a program looking into space. From launching unmanned vehicles into orbit to launching a satellite named American Star that would orbit Earth visible to all. First, however, it was needed to approach the subject cautiously. Put together a group of respected researchers, scientists and engineers, and try to find the funding. Meanwhile, colliers were keen to keep von Braun in their freelance employ. The first article had conceptualized entering space and existing. The next were to look at the moon. So whilst managing the Redstone project in Huntsville, for which the Americans were in Germany recruiting more rocket scientists for the program, von Braun was spending more time in publishers' offices debating the quality of the continued material, whilst in the meantime fighting with the publisher in Germany over his novel that he believed, quite rightly, was bastardized completely by Wernher. Speeches, books, papers and research councils appealing to the military, government and public alike, he was playing every card he could hold. When he felt the tide was moving in his favor, he asked for $4 billion to begin research. With his request denied, von Braun, tenacious as ever, plodded on. The moon articles were a huge success when printed later in that year, but skepticism of the feasibility still overweighed a public opinion that might spur the new President Eisenhower to pursue the cause of dominating the world from space. Meanwhile, the Redstone program had fallen behind, and the first test took place on a test stand made from scrap metal in August 1953, a month after the armistice that placed the stalemate of the Korean War as a constant. The test was to take place at Cape Canaveral in Florida, at the new National Missile Range that belonged to the Air Force. The rocket flew and seemed to be a success until it crashed into the sea 7 miles away, the guidance system having failed. In January 1954, RS-2 would launch successfully, but the plague of the V-2's luck followed it, with the third blowing up, followed by partial success with the fourth and the fifth. Nevertheless, the Redstone project was picking up. Perhaps those witnessing the launches were caught with the same feelings of glee to which Speer and Goering had demonstrated when watching the V-2's launch, the raw power infecting those around with awe. Eisenhower's policies seemed to be in line with this. The soldier itself might be a thing of the past if the Redstone rockets worked, and, as intercontinental ballistic missiles, it might be possible not to have to put troops on the ground if the threat of massive nuclear missile retaliation would hang over any nation America declared would be its enemy. In his other life as a celebrity, the natural progression from speeches to publications to radio had reached its zenith with television. In summer 1954, after repeated approaches that had to be turned down to other contractual obligations, Wernher von Braun signed a contract with Disney. It was to produce a show that was to walk the viewer through the process and the progress of the design of a rocket, naturally changed so that it appeased more toward the imagination and the necessary steps that would take man from Earth into space. Wernher was to walk the viewer through every progression with his charismatic and infectious passion for the subject, and they began shooting in October 1954. Von Braun presents with eyes reading from boards on which the script is written. He points to designs that seems comical to our eyes, and perhaps even comical to his own. They look nothing like any space vehicle ever launched. However, the video serves its purpose. It breaks down the most complicated endeavor man has ever undertaken into segments that allow the layman to understand the process. He explains that if they were to start on that day, an orbital spaceship could be designed and tested in 10 years. He then goes on to explain the testing process. It was a man speaking to the government as much as a child sat in their pajamas watching it on television. The broadcast was aired on the 9th of March 1955, and just a month later von Braun would become an American citizen. And in an effort to display his allegiance, the swearing in was also broadcast. Further productions from Disney would follow, all even today, are worth a watch, if but to see a time when America dreamed of the future and not of the past. In July of 1955, von Braun had to swallow a very bittersweet pill. Eisenhower announced that America would be pursuing a satellite program, but not with the rocket designs that von Braun and a council had decided to put forward, which were well developed and based on existing technology, but designed to put a minimal load into space merely to beat the Soviets, and it was named Orbiter. Those who decided instead went on to choose the proposal from Milton Rosen. Rosen had been working at the Naval Research Laboratory on the competitor von Braun's and the Army's V-2 program, named the Viking rockets, a variation of which was part of Rosen's proposal. Von Braun was infuriated, especially as he predicted correctly that the Rosen project would be more difficult and more expensive to carry out. So confident was von Braun that when he returned to Huntsville, he kept his orbiter idea alive by diverting resources to it just under a different name. With the later Redstone's rockets 27 and 29 earmarked for tests to perform tasks in this guise. Further contracts to Huntsville for intermediate-range ballistic missiles allowed von Braun to expand his team, and for those working at the site to further and accelerate research and testing. In February of 1956, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, with Wernher von Braun as director, was established. Under him were to work and operate 3,000 people on derivatives of the Redstone projects. Whilst the numbers were still not quite as high as the days of Peenemünde, 3,000 people would help von Braun edge towards his goal. The Redstone missiles were greatly increasing with range through research and naturally looked nothing like the designs on the Disney films von Braun was making at the same time, but the successes were encouraging. The missiles were now to be called Jupiter, and they could carry a 680-kilo megaton-class thermonuclear warhead. Meanwhile, Rosen was struggling with contractors to produce his rocket, and all the time von Braun had his ace hidden up his sleeve, ready to step in when Rosen failed. It was planned that a Jupiter would be stripped back, lightened, have a different combination of fuel, and would be able to carry a singular, tiny radio satellite to space, and it would be designated as Jupiter-C. The first was to launch in September with the designation RS-27. Not longer after midnight had passed and the 20th of September had begun did a countdown begin in a light rain at Cape Canaveral. Von Braun had travelled to witness the launch, and he stood with colleagues and engineers and representatives from Washington who were there to make sure he wasn't planning on launching a satellite without permission. The RS-27 probably would have been capable if it were not for the fact that the fourth stage contained sand instead of rocket fuel. When the countdown reached 1, the rocket floated on a jet of propulsion, then soared into the air. Von Braun watched on as he had done with Dornberger when the first of their V-2s had entered space. But this time the RS-27, with its multiple stages, was to far exceed the V-2. Into the air it climbed and accelerated past 20,000 kilometers an hour, reaching 20,600 at peak velocity and a height of 1,098 kilometers. The success was short-lived, however. The Army and Air Force had been bickering over who had the rights to launch missiles, and eventually it came to a head when Secretary of Defense Wilson limited the Army, to which the Redstone program belonged, to launching weapons within a range of 320 kilometers. This decision being made on the 18th of November. The program seemed further in doubt when the Navy withdrew to focus on a 2-stage missile that could be launched from a submarine by the use of solid fuel, named Polaris. It was looking like again von Braun had reached great heights only to be cut down. Yet there was a settlement. ABMA Redstone Jupiter rockets would continue development, Wilson ruled, but only for the Air Force to put into service. It allowed von Braun a narrow window to continue operations. Come the new year, the competition between the ABMA team and Milton Rosen Viking rocket almost played out tit for tat as rockets launched by Milton Rosen exploded on the launch pad. Then the Redstone Jupiter A, now called the AM-1, would explode in the air. The following Viking was exploded remotely when it looked to be heading for Orlando, but then the AM-1 exploded due to the fuel sloshing around. This was followed by a Viking exploding on the launch pad a full 5 minutes before the launch sequence was initiated. On the 15th of May, a Jupiter-C was launched, reaching an altitude of 560 kilometers. And finally, on the 31st of May, 1957, an AM-1 launched again, and this time flew 2,123 kilometers. For the second launch of the Jupiter-C, it was realized the materials protecting the nose cone had whittled down under the temperatures it was put through, and led to von Braun and his research team designing a new one that would resist these temperatures, which was successfully demonstrated when a Jupiter-C rocket launched in a Juno configuration, where there was the additional fourth stage on top of this third stage, and launched on the 8th of August 1957 and reached an altitude of 460 kilometers. Yet again, though, great success was met with sudden disappointment. This time the disappointment did not come from within the American government or military system, but rather from above.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. Here an artist's conception of how the feat was accomplished. A three-stage rocket. Number one, the booster in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age.
On the 4th of October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. For von Braun, it was embodied frustration. Sputnik was circling Earth at an orbital height of 577 kilometers, just over half the launch distance of the first Jupiter-C von Braun had sent into space. It would have been entirely possible for America to have completed the feat first, but nevertheless, the medal of putting the first satellite into orbit now belonged permanently to the people he had sworn were his enemies, the Soviets. The Soviets had launched not only Sputnik, but they had launched the space age. Whatever Wernher von Braun did now, he was going to be second. Still, the American government pushed the opposing Vanguard program and asked if ABMA could help. Suddenly, then, von Braun fell 2 steps behind. The launch of Sputnik was one thing, a tiny radio transmitter in a casing weighing in total 83.6 kilos. But on the 3rd of November, less than a month since the first launch, Sputnik 2 was launched, and this time it carried a payload of 508 kilos and the first living being purposefully sent into orbit, Laika the dog. On the 6th of December, the Vanguard rocket, a modified Viking designated TV-3, was placed on the launch pad. It was launched, fixed atop with a 1.5 kilo satellite, and it reached the dizzying heights of 1.2 meters, before it fell back the short distance onto the ground and exploded, on live television, for the world to see, America's Flopnik. For von Braun, the failure of the Vanguard program, the adapted Viking rockets, meant that the army received the funding to try and match the Soviet program, and in turn they placed their modified Jupiter-C, called Juno, named for the Queen of the Gods, on the launch pad. Inside the nose cone was Explorer 1. On the 31st of January 1958, Wernher von Braun was summoned to Washington to be prepped to be placed in a news conference as his team gathered at the Cape to fire Juno. In Washington, von Braun, bitterly annoyed he had to miss the launch due to political reasons, was placed in a room with a projection of a teletype machine that received information from the Cape. There was no phone lines open, no television stream, just the image of a piece of paper that would show words as they were typed hundreds of kilometers away.
At Cape Canaveral, Florida, the Army's Jupiter-C rocket is ready for America's second attempt to launch a space satellite. No relation to the IRBM Jupiter, this is a rebuilt Redstone, a 200-mile missile carrying, instead of a warhead, 3 stages of solid-fuel booster rockets and the Explorer, a 6-foot bullet only inches across, crammed with electronic gear. 30 pounds of payload. This close-up of the United States edition of Sputnik was made at a press conference with leaders of the scientific teams, Dr. Wernher von Braun, Dr. James Van Allen, and Dr. William Pickering. a three-way collaboration between private industry, academic science, and the military. Jupiter C stands poised on its launching pad. The hours-long countdown approaches zero, a moment of enormous tension, for every missile launching is still an experiment. Any one of tens of thousands of things can go wrong, with catastrophic results. But all that can be done to assure perfection has been done. The moment is at hand. The countdown reaches zero.
At 10:48 p.m., the teletype, after building up the launch time with a countdown, burst into life, and the news that the rocket was still going kept coming through. Eventually the news came that the rocket had disappeared from sight. However, they had to wait for the orbit of the satellite, if it were a success, to come around to receive the news. Then, almost 2 hours after the launch, the news came through. The transmitter stations were picking up a signal, and von Braun had put a satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit.
Broadcasting to the world its coded scientific data. Cosmic ray intensity, meteor impact, solar radiation. These are the dry facts that will help carry man ever farther into the age of space.
With the launch of Explorer 1 and the age of space, the space race between the Soviets and the Americans began in earnest. Within the same year, it was agreed that a new organization with a budget of $100 million was needed to put America on the right path towards achievements in space. The Army Ballistics Agency and the United States Naval Research Laboratory were incorporated into this new, singular body, NASA. And this is where our journey ends. The complexities of the history of NASA and the launches to the moon into which Wernher von Braun, professor by Hitler's hand, was part of go far beyond my historical scope and certainly my technological knowledge. Therefore, I recommend listening to Houston We Have a Podcast, NASA Explorers Apollo, and the Rocket Ranch podcast to understand more about NASA and its history. Meanwhile, a note on the man we have followed throughout this journey. Wernher von Braun would ultimately join NASA 2 years after its creation and become the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville in 1960, a position he would hold until 1970. In his time, he was responsible for the Saturn V rockets that powered the Apollo program and ultimately accomplished his dream of putting man on the moon. In 1970, he relocated to a NASA role based out of Washington, from which he retired from in 1972 and became Vice President of Engineering and Development at Fairchild Industries, coincidentally located in Germantown, Maryland. In 1973, he was diagnosed with kidney cancer, and ultimately in 1977, he would die from pancreatic cancer after being awarded with the National Medal of Science earlier that same year. I thank you for joining me on this journey. Whilst the main narrative here comes to an end, there are still more stories to tell. In the future, I hope myself to travel to the sites where rockets were developed and the horrors of the rocket production were carried out, with the intention of producing content on Patreon. These stories will remember not only people like Arthur Rudolph and Dornberger, but also, even more importantly, I wish to tell the stories of those people that suffered in the camps as a result of the V2 production. I hope you have enjoyed this series. A special thank you goes to Kevin, Arcton History's latest Patreon. You can support Arcton History yourself for as little as €1 a month on patreon.com/Arcton History. This has been The Nazi and the Moon, presented by myself, Simon J. James, and produced by the Berlin Tour Guide. Follow Arcton History on Instagram and Twitter at Arcton History, or visit the website at theberlintourguide.com/Arcton History. Thank you again to all who have listened and shared, and we'll be back next week with new stories from history.